Malik stood at the doorstep of his father's home, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder feeling heavier than it should. He had always dreaded this moment. The weight of failure pressed on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for had crumbled around him. His eyes briefly scanned the large mansion before him, a symbol of everything his father had achieved. It was impressive but distant, much like the man inside it. Malik's journey had been anything but easy. He had spent the last few years working in a corporate office, trying to build a life for himself. His first job out of college had been at a promising tech startup. In those early days, he was full of ambition, eager to prove his worth. The work was fast-paced, and he thrived on the pressure. He loved the idea of creating something new, of seeing the tangible results of his efforts. But over time, the enthusiasm faded. The company, once filled with energy and promise, began to show cracks. The founder was reckless with finances, and the startup culture, once brimming with creative freedom, turned into a cutthroat environment. Malik felt the tension in the air every day, watching as employees came and went, their positions replaced by cheaper alternatives. Despite his hard work, he was always one step behind the politics that dominated the office. When the company finally folded due to mismanagement, Malik's world collapsed along with it. He found himself unemployed and adrift. The months that followed were a blur of failed job interviews and freelance gigs that never quite paid enough to cover the bills. Malik had tried to maintain his independence, but each setback chipped away at his pride. The stress mounted, and before long, he couldn't keep up with his rent. He was evicted from his apartment, and the last shred of control he thought he had vanished. Standing there now, on the doorstep of his father's mansion, Malik couldn't help but feel the sting of failure. His father had always been the picture of success, wealthy, powerful, and cold. James had always made it clear that Malik needed to make something of himself, and now, Malik was returning, not as the man he had hoped to be, but as someone who had lost everything. The thought of going back to that place, the home that had never truly felt like home, was a bitter pill to swallow. After a long pause, Malik rang the doorbell. The door swung open, and there stood James, tall, stoic, and distant as always. He barely looked at Malik as he stepped aside to let him in. "Come in," James said, his voice devoid of emotion. Malik entered the house, his steps echoing in the grand hallway. The house was everything Malik had always resented, pristine, cold, and silent. It reeked of wealth and a kind of isolation that had always defined his relationship with his father. As he moved through the house, he could feel the weight of the years he had spent away from it. Each room felt like a distant memory, a time when he had hoped for a connection that never materialized. "Dinner's almost ready," a voice called from the kitchen, and Malik turned to see Olivia. Olivia, his stepmother, was a striking woman, graceful, elegant, and seemingly effortless in her beauty. She wasn't like James. Olivia's presence always had a warmth to it, a comfort that Malik had never felt from his father. She had always been kind to him, even when James was cold and distant. "Malik, it's been a while," she said, her smile gentle. There was something comforting about her tone, a softness that made him feel welcome in a way he hadn't expected. As they sat down for dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. James spoke about his investments and business dealings, his voice never faltering. He asked Malik about his job situation in a way that felt more like an interrogation than a conversation. Malik tried to explain, but each word seemed to make him feel smaller. James's disappointment was clear. "You should have done better, Malik. You had the potential, but you wasted it," he said, his words sharp, cutting through the air. Malik felt the sting of those words, his frustration bubbling up inside him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Olivia, sensing the growing tension, intervened. "James, give him some space. It's not easy to rebuild after everything Malik's been through," Olivia said, her voice soft but firm. James scoffed and dismissed her, but Malik couldn't ignore the comfort Olivia's words brought him. She wasn't like his father, she didn't expect perfection, didn't demand that he live up to an impossible standard. The dinner continued in awkward silence, the conversation shifting from topic to topic, but nothing could ease the uncomfortable feeling that hung in the air. Malik ate quietly, lost in thought, his mind racing with questions. What was he doing here? Why had he come back to this place, this house that felt more like a prison than a home? Olivia, noticing his discomfort, leaned in slightly and offered him a gentle smile. You'll find your way again, Malik. Everyone hits a rough patch. You're stronger than you think. Her words, though kind, felt like a temporary balm to a wound that ran much deeper. Malik didn't know how to respond. He didn't feel strong, and he didn't feel like he had any direction. His life had unraveled, and all he had left was the resentment and anger he had been carrying for years. But Olivia's warmth, her kindness, felt like a lifeline in a sea of cold indifference. The evening came to a close, and Malik retreated to the room that had been prepared for him. As he lay in the unfamiliar bed, his mind kept returning to the past, the years he had spent avoiding his father, the bitterness that had poisoned their relationship. He knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult. The house was large, but it felt empty. And he would have to find a way to live here, under the same roof as a man he could never seem to please. As sleep finally claimed him, Malik wondered what lay ahead in this strange new chapter of his life. Would things change for the better, or would they continue down the same path? Only time would tell. The days following Malik's return were filled with tension. Despite the outward appearance of normalcy, every interaction with James felt strained. James, ever the businessman, couldn't seem to mask his disappointment in Malik's lack of progress. There were subtle comments about laziness, about wasted opportunities. Maybe you should get up earlier. You can't expect to change anything sitting around all day, James would say as he sipped his morning coffee, his eyes never leaving his newspaper. Malik, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, would nod but say little. He didn't want to argue, he didn't want to confront James, not yet. But inside, the resentment simmered. Every word from James felt like a reminder of his failures. But it was Olivia who seemed to notice the strain the most. She would often find Malik in the kitchen, silently staring out the window or lost in his thoughts. Her presence brought him comfort, though it also made him uneasy. He wasn't sure why, but there was something about Olivia's kindness that felt too much like an invitation to get too close. One evening, when Malik had returned from a frustrating interview, Olivia caught him in the hallway. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft with genuine concern. "It didn't," Malik replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "They said I didn't have the experience they were looking for. It's always the same story." Olivia placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't give up. The right opportunity will come. You just have to be patient." Her touch lingered for a moment too long, and Malik couldn't ignore the strange, electric feeling it caused. He pulled away slightly, unsure of what he was feeling. Was it gratitude? Or was it something else? As days passed, Olivia continued to be his only source of support, while James remained distant and critical. The growing tension in the house was undeniable, and Malik found himself more and more drawn to Olivia's warmth, her kindness, her understanding. The days passed in a blur, and Malik's unease only grew. His job search continued to be fruitless, and with each rejection, his confidence shattered a little more. Every day, he would walk past his father's office, where James would sit with his business associates, barking orders and making deals. The sight made Malik feel small, like he was stuck in a perpetual cycle of failure, always falling short of his father's expectations. But as the days turned into weeks, something inside Malik shifted. There was a sense of isolation that began to swallow him whole, He was no longer a young man making his way in the world but a failure clinging to the remnants of his past. At night, the mansion was quiet, too quiet for his liking. The silence echoed through the halls, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of conversation between James and Olivia. It was during these moments of stillness that Malik would find himself wandering the house, aimlessly, with no particular destination in mind. Sometimes, he would end up in the kitchen, where Olivia was preparing dinner. She had a way of moving through the space with grace, her soft voice drifting through the air as she hummed a quiet tune. There was an ease to her movements that Malik found strangely calming, a stark contrast to the tension he felt everywhere else. One evening, after a particularly difficult phone interview, Malik entered the kitchen, his shoulders slumped with the weight of failure. Olivia was there, as always, chopping vegetables with a focus that seemed to distance her from the world around her. "Another rejection?" she asked, not looking up, but her tone was gentle, as if she already knew the answer. Malik nodded. "Yeah. I'm starting to think maybe I'm just not cut out for this. I've tried everything. Nothing seems to work." Olivia paused and turned to face him. Her expression softened, and she placed the knife down on the counter. "Don't be so hard on yourself. You've been through a lot. You'll find your way. But you can't give up now. You're smarter and stronger than you give yourself credit for." Her words had a profound effect on Malik. The warmth in her voice, the sincerity in her gaze, were unlike anything he had experienced in a long time. For the first time in weeks, Malik felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know why, but Olivia's kindness seemed to penetrate the walls he had built around himself. "Thanks," Malik muttered, feeling a strange tension building between them. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of his failures or the unexpected comfort he felt in her presence, but something was stirring inside him. It wasn't long before the small moments between them grew into something deeper. Olivia's soft touches, her quiet encouragement, became a source of solace. And Malik, who had spent so much of his life trying to avoid his father's gaze, now found himself yearning for Olivia's approval. It was a strange, almost intoxicating feeling, one that he couldn't quite explain. One evening, as the two of them sat together at the kitchen table after dinner, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. Olivia spoke about her past, her childhood, and the choices she had made that had brought her to this point in her life. Malik listened intently, intrigued by the glimpses of vulnerability she allowed him to see. "My life wasn't always so perfect," Olivia said with a soft chuckle. "I had my share of mistakes, just like everyone else. But the thing is, I never let them define me." Malik nodded, captivated by her words. He had always seen Olivia as the ideal woman, composed, elegant, and wise. But now, as he looked at her, he saw something different. There was a rawness to her that made her feel more human, more accessible. "You seem like you have it all together," Malik said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Olivia smiled, a warm, understanding smile. "I don't. No one does. But I've learned that life isn't about perfection. It's about being willing to try, even when things don't go as planned." There was a long pause, the air thick with unspoken words. Malik felt something stirring inside him, something he didn't fully understand. It was as if the walls he had carefully constructed around his emotions were starting to crumble. Olivia's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, and for a brief second, Malik wondered if she saw the same thing in him. He quickly shook the thought away. There was no way, he had to be imagining it. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Malik couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to their connection. As the days went on, Malik found himself spending more and more time with Olivia. She seemed to sense the distance between him and James, and without saying a word, she filled the gap, offering him companionship and support when he needed it most. James, as usual, was preoccupied with his business dealings. He hardly noticed the growing closeness between Malik and Olivia, absorbed in his own world of wealth and power. But Malik noticed. The more time he spent with Olivia, the more he felt a pull toward her, an attraction that went beyond her kindness and warmth. One evening, as the two of them were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, the air between them felt charged, electric. Malik had always thought of Olivia as his father's wife, someone who was untouchable, out of reach. But now, as he looked at her, he saw something different, something that made his heart race. "Malik," Olivia said softly, breaking the silence. "I know you're struggling, but I need you to understand that you're not alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." Her words, so full of tenderness, melted Malik's resistance. Without thinking, he turned to face her, his breath quickening. There was something in her eyes, something that he couldn't ignore. And in that moment, he knew that the lines between them were beginning to blur. As she reached out to touch his hand, Malik's mind raced. This wasn't right. She was his stepmother. He had no business feeling this way about her. But the more he tried to push the thoughts away, the more they consumed him. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She looked at him, her gaze soft yet filled with an intensity he hadn't seen before. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her breath warm against his skin. It was in that moment that Malik realized how dangerous this all was. But it was too late. The connection they had built was undeniable. The air between them crackled with tension, and neither of them knew how to pull back from the edge. Malik couldn't sleep that night. His mind raced with the events of the day, replaying every interaction with Olivia over and over again. The touch of her hand, the warmth of her voice, the way she had looked at him, he couldn't get it out of his head. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions inside him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He knew the consequences, the risks. But what could he do? His heart was pulling him in one direction, and his mind, desperate for logic, kept telling him to stop. But Malik couldn't stop. The pull was too strong. And as he lay there in the dark, he knew that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. If you're enjoying Malik's story and the tension building between him and Olivia, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more twists and turns in the coming acts. Stay tuned for more, as we dive deeper into the emotional conflict and suspense that's just getting started. Malik couldn't stop thinking about Olivia. It was as if every moment he spent with her was a reflection of something deeper, something he was too scared to face. The guilt gnawed at him every day, but there was an undeniable force pulling him back to her, like a magnetic field he could neither escape nor resist. The following morning, Malik awoke with the familiar weight of dread pressing down on him. He had gone to bed trying to push everything aside, telling himself that it was all in his head. But as soon as he saw Olivia in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with her usual grace, all his resolve melted away. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth, but also something unspoken. Malik muttered a response, though his mind was a whirlpool of confusion. He wanted to ask her about the tension between them, about the strange feelings he couldn't shake, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? He was trapped, caught between the world he had known and a dangerous new reality that was rapidly consuming him. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked, turning from the stove. Her gaze was steady, almost too steady, as though she could see right through him. He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah. Just tired." But that wasn't the truth. Malik had never been more awake, more alive, and more terrified in his entire life. As they sat down for breakfast, the silence between them was thick, suffocating. The air was charged with something unspoken, an electric tension that neither of them could acknowledge out loud. Malik's mind kept circling back to that moment on the porch, the way Olivia had leaned in close, the way her touch had lingered just a bit too long. It felt like an invitation, one that was impossible to ignore. "What are you thinking about?" Olivia's voice broke the silence, her eyes locked on his with a penetrating gaze. Malik could barely meet her eyes. "Nothing. Just work stuff." But that was a lie. The truth was, every thought he had was consumed by her. The way she moved. The way she spoke. The way she made him feel things he had never imagined possible. Olivia seemed to sense the internal battle waging inside him, but she said nothing more. Instead, she stood up, clearing the table in one smooth motion. Malik watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't get her out of his mind, and yet he was afraid to even acknowledge the growing attraction he felt toward her. It felt like a betrayal, not just of his father, but of the family itself. "Malik, you're a good man," Olivia said softly as she cleared the dishes. "I just want you to know that. Don't ever doubt yourself." Her words were like a balm to his wounded pride, but they also made him feel even more conflicted. He had always admired her, but now he couldn't tell if it was admiration or something else entirely. As he stood to leave, he caught a glimpse of her face, eyes downcast, lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. There it was again, the unspoken connection between them, pulling them together in a way neither of them could fully understand. It was late one evening when Malik's internal struggle finally reached a breaking point. The house was quiet, the sounds of James's deep sleep reverberating through the walls. Malik wandered through the corridors of the mansion, aimlessly, restlessly. His thoughts were like a whirlwind, and each time they landed on Olivia, the tornado of guilt and desire grew stronger. He found himself in the living room, gazing out the large windows into the dark night. The mansion stood alone on the outskirts of town, far from the reach of neighbors or prying eyes. It was the perfect hiding place for the secrets Malik had been keeping, and yet, the solitude of the space only made him feel more isolated. He turned when he heard the soft creak of the door behind him. Olivia stood there, framed by the light from the hallway, her silhouette soft and ethereal. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. Her eyes were searching his, as if she were waiting for him to say something, anything, to break the tension. Malik swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Everything he wanted to say felt wrong, out of place. But at that moment, there was only one thing on his mind. Without thinking, he stepped toward her. The air between them seemed to pulse with energy, every step he took feeling like a violation of some invisible law. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice hoarse with desire and fear. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Her hand reached up to gently touch his face, sending a shock of electricity through him. And then, without another word, she leaned in. Malik's heart raced as their lips met, tentatively at first, like a question, a hesitation. But then the kiss deepened, and all the confusion, all the guilt, all the years of restraint and distance melted away. For a moment, there was no right or wrong, no father or son, no stepmother or stepson. There was only them, lost in the forbidden, intoxicating pull that bound them together. When they finally pulled away, they both stood there in stunned silence, as if the gravity of the moment had taken them both by surprise. Malik's breath was heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. "I shouldn't have done that," Olivia murmured, her voice trembling. Malik shook his head, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. "Neither should I." But the damage was done. They both knew that. And the consequences of their actions would change everything. The days following the kiss were filled with tension. Neither Malik nor Olivia spoke of what had happened, but the weight of it hung between them like a dark cloud, suffocating and inescapable. Malik found it hard to focus on anything other than Olivia. The slightest touch, the softest word from her sent his heart racing. He could feel the change in her too, the way she looked at him with that mixture of desire and fear, as if she were struggling to control the same emotions he had been fighting. One afternoon, as Malik sat in his father's office, pretending to work on his resume, his thoughts kept drifting back to Olivia. He thought about the way she had kissed him, the way her touch had made him feel alive in a way he had never felt before. But with every passing moment, the guilt grew heavier. He couldn't keep pretending that nothing had happened. He couldn't pretend that this wasn't destroying him from the inside out. That night, as Olivia prepared dinner, Malik walked into the kitchen, his mind made up. "Olivia," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She looked up from her work, and he saw the wariness in her eyes. "We can't do this," Malik said, his voice thick with regret. "This is wrong. I'm sorry. I should never have let it go this far." Olivia took a step toward him, her hand reaching out as if to stop him. "Malik, please." Her voice faltered, and for the first time, Malik saw the fear in her eyes. But it was too late. He had already made up his mind. Malik's journey continues to spiral as he faces the consequences of his forbidden desires. What will happen next? Will he and Olivia be able to pull away from the dangerous path they've set upon? Like, share, and subscribe to find out what comes next in this gripping story. You won't want to miss it. Malik's decision to pull away from Olivia was harder than he ever imagined. Every day felt like a battle, each step more difficult than the last. He had returned to his routine, his obligations, and his father's expectations, but all of it felt hollow now. Nothing seemed to matter anymore, except the woman who had once been his father's wife and who now occupied every corner of his mind. Days passed in a haze. Malik tried to focus on the future, on getting a job, on moving forward, but it was impossible to concentrate with Olivia so close, her presence like a shadow in the periphery of his vision. Every time he saw her, it felt like a reminder of the kiss they shared, of the boundaries they crossed, and the damage they had done to everything they knew. One night, after a long day of avoiding any direct contact with Olivia, Malik found himself sitting in the living room, his thoughts in turmoil. He couldn't keep running from this. He had tried to pretend it hadn't happened, but the truth kept resurfacing. He needed to confront Olivia, to apologize, to fix things. He couldn't let it all fall apart like this. As he made his way to her room, the weight of his actions bore down on him. He reached her door and paused, unsure of what to say. But when he opened the door, what he saw hit him like a ton of bricks. Olivia was sitting on the edge of her bed, her back to the door, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and Malik's heart clenched in his chest. "Olivia?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. She froze, looking over her shoulder at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She quickly wiped her face, trying to regain composure, but Malik could see it, the pain, the heartbreak, the confusion. She was as lost as he was. "Malik, I don't know what I was thinking," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This whole thing, it was wrong. We both know that." Malik stepped forward, his hand outstretched, but she backed away, shaking her head. "No, don't. Don't try to fix this. You don't understand. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I never wanted to hurt you," Malik said, his voice shaking. I was confused. I didn't know what to feel anymore. But I know it was wrong. I know it was a mistake." Olivia looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You're my stepson. You're like a son to me. This has ruined everything." "No," Malik protested, his heart racing. "You mean more to me than just that. I didn't mean for this to happen. But She held up her hand, silencing him. "Stop, Malik. It's done. We can't undo this. What we did, it will always be a part of us now." Malik felt like the walls were closing in around him. He wanted to reach for her, to take away her pain, but the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was bigger than just their kiss. This had shattered the foundation of their entire relationship. "I'm sorry," Malik whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't be sorry," she said bitterly. "Just don't. Because nothing will fix this. Nothing will erase what we've done." There was a long silence between them, the tension hanging thick in the air. Malik could hear his heartbeat thumping in his ears as he stood there, unsure of what to do. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him like a heavy stone. But then, Olivia did something that stunned him. She stood up, walked toward him, and placed her hand on his chest. "You're a good man, Malik," she said, her voice steady but broken. "But we've both made a mistake. And now, we need to figure out how to live with that." Malik felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes as he looked at her, searching for any hint of hope, any sign that this could be fixed. But there was none. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. "I don't know if we can," Malik said softly. The days following their confrontation were filled with tension and uncertainty. Malik tried to avoid Olivia, tried to keep his distance, but it was impossible to ignore the elephant in the room. He couldn't help but notice how their interactions had changed. There was a palpable awkwardness between them now, like the air itself was tainted by the kiss they had shared. It wasn't just Olivia who seemed different. Malik himself felt as though he were walking through life in a haze. He wasn't the same person anymore. The weight of what they had done weighed heavily on him, and he knew it wasn't just their relationship that had been affected. His father, James, had begun to notice the strange shift between them, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. James was no fool. He had always been observant, always quick to pick up on even the smallest change in behavior. And so, one evening, as Malik sat in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, James walked in, his face serious. "Malik," James began, his tone stern, "I've been noticing some tension between you and Olivia lately. Is everything all right?" Malik froze, unsure of how to respond. His mind was racing, scrambling for an excuse, a way to avoid the truth. "Yeah," Malik said, his voice strained. "Everything's fine." James raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Don't lie to me, son. I can tell when something's wrong." Malik's stomach twisted. How could he explain this? How could he explain the mess he had gotten himself into without betraying everything? "It's just personal stuff," Malik said finally, his words lacking conviction. James didn't press further, but Malik could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken questions lingering in the air. Later that night, as Malik lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world was on the brink of collapse. The kiss. The lies. The guilt. It had all led to this moment, and Malik wasn't sure how much more he could take. The tension was unbearable. Malik knew that something had to change, and it had to change soon. He could no longer live in this constant state of turmoil, constantly battling between what was right and what he felt. He couldn't be a part of this any longer. He couldn't keep living under the same roof as Olivia, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. He needed to leave. For his own sanity, for his future, for his family's sake, he had to walk away. And so, the next morning, as he packed his things, ready to leave the home that had once felt so comfortable, Malik took a final look at the life he was leaving behind. The life that had been so much easier, so much simpler, before he met Olivia. Before he kissed her. As he drove away, the weight in his chest grew heavier, the reality of his decision settling in. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew it was time to leave the past behind. Malik's world is crumbling, and the choices he made have changed everything. Will he be able to find redemption? Can he fix the broken bonds? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for the next chapter of this intense, emotional journey. The story is far from over, don't miss out. Malik had left the house, left the life he knew, but he didn't feel free. The road ahead felt uncertain, like a fog he couldn't see through. His mind was clouded with thoughts of Olivia, of the consequences of their actions, and of the guilt that weighed on his heart. His father had no idea where he was, and that was just how Malik wanted it. He couldn't bear to face him right now, not when everything was falling apart. He moved into a small, dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was the first time in years that Malik had truly been alone with his thoughts, and he hated every minute of it. The loneliness suffocated him. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the images of Olivia, her face, her touch. His emotions were in a constant state of turmoil, and there seemed to be no way out. He spent his days trying to find work, trying to put some distance between himself and the past. But no matter how much time passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running from something he couldn't outrun. The more he tried to focus on finding stability, the more his thoughts kept drifting back to her. To Olivia. His phone buzzed. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. "Malik, it's me, Olivia. Please, we need to talk. I'm not okay." His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen. He hadn't spoken to Olivia since that night, hadn't heard from her in days. But the message was clear, she needed him. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keys, then he typed back. "I can't do this anymore. We've crossed a line that we can't undo." A few seconds later, his phone buzzed again. Olivia's response was simple, but it hit him harder than anything he'd felt in a long time. "Please. Just come see me. For closure. For us." Malik stared at the message, torn. He had to face this. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep pretending that everything would get better with time. It wouldn't. He knew that now. The drive back to the house felt like an eternity. Malik couldn't help but think about how everything had changed. This house used to feel like home, but now it felt foreign, distant, like it was never meant to be his. He pulled up in front of the house, his stomach twisting in knots. As he walked to the door, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was going to say to Olivia, but he knew that it needed to be said. No more avoiding it. No more pretending. Olivia was waiting for him in the living room when he walked in. She was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The sight of her broke Malik's heart, but he couldn't let his emotions take over this time. They needed to talk. They needed to figure out where they stood. "Olivia," Malik began, his voice shaking slightly. I don't know what to say anymore. I wish I could take everything back. I wish I never kissed you. I wish none of this happened." She didn't look up at him. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I don't know why we did it, Malik. I don't know what I was thinking. It feels like it was some kind of mistake, something that was never meant to happen. But now I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if we can." Malik took a step forward, but he stopped himself, unsure if he should approach her. The distance between them was growing, and the more he tried to bridge it, the harder it seemed to be. "I never wanted to hurt you," Malik said quietly. "And I don't want to hurt anyone else. I know this is a mess. I know what we did was wrong, and I can't undo that. But I'm trying to figure out how to live with myself, how to make things right." Olivia finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "And how do you plan to do that? You left. You ran away. You left me here, alone. You think that fixes things?" Malik winced. "I didn't know what else to do. I had to leave, for both of us. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't pretend anymore. But I'm here now. I came back for closure. I came back to face this, to face you. There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was deafening, the weight of their emotions heavy in the air. Finally, Olivia spoke again. You left, Malik. And maybe you needed to. But I didn't have a choice. I was stuck. And I don't know what to do with myself now. Everything feels shattered. Everything feels broken. Malik's heart ached. He didn't know what to say to make it better. There was nothing he could do to fix the situation. The damage was done. I'm sorry, Malik whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to make it right. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can ever fix this. But I'm trying. I'll always be sorry for what happened. As Malik and Olivia sat in the silence that followed their conversation, it became clear that they were both at a crossroads. There was no going back to how things were before. The kiss, the lies, the betrayal, it had all changed them. But there was still a chance for healing. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was possible. Olivia took a deep breath and wiped her eyes. Maybe we can't go back. Maybe we can't fix what's broken. But we can move forward. We can figure out how to rebuild, even if it's just one step at a time. Malik nodded slowly, the weight in his chest lightening just a little. Maybe, but we need time. We need space. We need to figure out who we are now. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn how to live with the consequences. Olivia nodded. I don't know if we can be what we were, but I don't want us to hate each other. I don't want this to be the end of everything. It doesn't have to be, Malik replied softly. But we'll have to take it one day at a time. Malik and Olivia are faced with the hard truth of their situation. Can they rebuild, or is their relationship beyond repair? Stay tuned for the next chapter, and remember to like, share, and subscribe for more intense twists and turns in this emotional journey. The hardest part is yet to come, so don't miss out. Days passed after Malik's return to Olivia's house. He had been trying to rebuild his life, focusing on his work and his healing, but there was something unresolved, something that gnawed at him. He had been torn between his guilt for hurting Olivia, his resentment towards his father, and the feeling that he still hadn't truly faced the damage done to himself. It was hard for Malik to forgive himself, let alone seek forgiveness from anyone else. Every time he tried to start over, the past crept up on him like a shadow. Olivia was still part of that past, and even though she had left the house, there was no escaping the ties they shared. One evening, after finishing a long shift at the restaurant where he had taken up a new job, Malik sat alone in his apartment. The only light was from the flickering street lamp outside, casting long shadows against the wall. His phone buzzed with a message from his father. James had been reaching out more often lately, but Malik wasn't sure he was ready to face him yet. I'm sorry for how things ended between us. Let's talk. You need to come home. The words were short, direct, and full of an emotion Malik rarely saw in his father, vulnerability. For a moment, he considered ignoring the message. He wasn't sure he could trust James. He had always been the one who left Malik feeling abandoned, isolated. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that avoiding the past would only keep him stuck. Maybe this was a chance to confront it head-on, to begin the healing process, not just for Olivia but for himself and his father. Malik stood up, walking over to the small kitchen table where his mother's old letters lay in a pile. He had been reading them recently, letters she had written before she passed, filled with raw emotion, love, and pain. There was something she had written that stuck with him, something he needed to remind himself of. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means letting go of the power the past has over you. He closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath. This was it. He had to make a choice. He needed to stop running. The next morning, Malik drove to his father's house. The decision wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. When he arrived, he was met by the emptiness of the large mansion. Nothing about it felt welcoming anymore. The place that once felt like home now only reminded him of his pain. James was in the living room when Malik walked in. His father's face was grizzled with age, the lines etched deep from years of stress and unresolved emotions. He looked up when Malik entered, but didn't speak immediately. There was an awkward silence before James finally spoke. "You've been gone for a while. I wasn't sure if you were ever coming back," James said, his voice quieter than usual. Malik felt a sharp pang in his chest. "I wasn't sure I wanted to. I wasn't sure I could face you after everything." James didn't respond right away, but the sadness in his eyes told Malik everything. "Look, son. I know I haven't been the father you needed. And I'm sorry. But I want to make it right. I want to fix this. I never wanted you to feel abandoned. That was never my intention." Malik stared at his father, unsure of how to respond. His emotions were a whirlwind, anger, hurt, confusion, all tangled together. But he knew this was the first step in mending what had been broken. "Why now?" Malik asked, his voice strained. "Why didn't you try before? Why didn't you see what was happening?" "I was scared," James said, his voice shaky now. "Scared of losing you, of losing everything. I thought I could fix it all on my own, but I couldn't. And now, I'm paying the price." For the first time in his life, Malik saw his father truly vulnerable, open, honest, and full of regret. It wasn't enough to erase the years of neglect, but it was a start. A real start. Malik took a deep breath, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet, but I want to try. I want to see if we can build something new from all of this. But I need time. I need space." James nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "Take all the time you need, son. I'm not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, Malik found a rhythm to his new life. He went to work, spent time with his father, and began to rebuild the pieces of himself that had been shattered. The burden of guilt didn't disappear, but it began to lift slowly, piece by piece. He hadn't seen Olivia in weeks, and part of him wondered if he ever would again. She had disappeared after the fallout, leaving the house for good. But Malik couldn't stop thinking about her. He wanted to believe that there was a chance for redemption between them, but he wasn't sure if it was something they could ever fully recover from. One evening, as Malik sat in his father's study, looking over some old family photos, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Olivia. "I can't fix what I've done, Malik. But I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I loved you, even if it was the wrong way. Please, don't hate me." The message hit Malik like a punch to the gut. Olivia had admitted so much, and yet, there was still so much unspoken. Malik stared at the phone for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Was forgiveness even possible? Could he forgive her, and could he forgive himself? Malik took a deep breath and composed himself. The years of pain, regret, and bitterness had led him to this moment. There was still a long road ahead, but he was finally ready to face it. He replied to Olivia, his message simple but filled with meaning. "I don't know where we go from here, Olivia. But I can't carry this guilt anymore. I don't know if we'll ever be okay, but I'm trying. I'm finally trying to move on. I hope you can find peace too." The response came hours later. "I hope you can, too. Goodbye, Malik." It wasn't a grand resolution, and it wasn't the ending he had imagined. But it was closure. They both had to let go of the past in order to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. And that, Malik realized, was all that really mattered. What will Malik's next steps be as he tries to find peace with the past? Can forgiveness truly heal the scars left by betrayal and guilt? Stay tuned for the next chapter, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more of this emotional journey. We're just getting started. Time passed, and Malik's life slowly began to settle into a new routine. His relationship with his father, James, remained fragile but was evolving into something more honest. They spent more time together, working on their strained connection, learning to communicate without resentment. While their past was far from perfect, both men understood that their relationship would never heal without effort and vulnerability. Malik had come to appreciate the slow, steady progress of forgiveness. It wasn't about forgetting the wrongs done, but understanding that both he and his father were capable of growth. The bitterness that had once clouded their interactions started to fade, replaced by a more mature bond, one that was built on a shared understanding of mistakes, regrets, and the willingness to change. Malik began to focus more on his own growth as well. He picked up his career again, taking on more responsibility at the restaurant and even pursuing his passion for photography, a hobby he had let go of during the darker days of his life. Slowly, his confidence returned, and with it, the hope that he could carve out a life that was truly his own. In the midst of all this, Malik couldn't forget Olivia. She had come into his life like a storm, shaking everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. Her absence had left a hole in his heart, but as time went on, Malik realized that he had to let go of her, of the past, and most importantly, of the guilt that had weighed him down for so long. It was a quiet evening when Malik received a letter from Olivia. He hadn't heard from her since their last exchange, and a strange knot tightened in his stomach as he opened the envelope. The letter was short, but every word carried weight. Malik. I've thought about everything we did, and I know there's no turning back. But I wanted you to know that I will always carry a piece of you with me. What we had was wrong, and I can't undo it. But I want you to understand that, for me, it was real. You helped me see a side of myself I never knew existed. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, and I hope you can find happiness in the life you deserve. Goodbye, and take care. Malik sat back, the letter in his hand. There was no closure he had expected, no grand reunion. But there was peace. Olivia had moved on, and so had he. In a way, this letter from her felt like the final piece of the puzzle that had been his healing process. A few weeks later, Malik received an unexpected phone call. It was his father, James. I'm proud of you, Malik, James said, his voice rough but sincere. I know I wasn't the best father, but I see you trying. And that means something. I just wanted you to know that I'll always be here. For the first time in years, Malik heard those words and felt them resonate deeply. He could finally hear his father's sincerity without the sting of rejection attached to it. I'm trying, Dad, Malik replied. I'm really trying. The call ended with both men knowing that their relationship, though imperfect, had come a long way. And even though they had lost so much time, the future was still theirs to shape. A few months later, Malik stood at the edge of a lake, the sunlight reflecting off the water. He had always found peace in nature, in the quiet moments of solitude. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he let it ring out. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to rush. He didn't need to answer to anyone but himself. He had come so far, through pain, through betrayal, through anger, and now, he was standing on the other side. There was still so much left to rebuild, but Malik knew that he was stronger now. He had found his own way. As he walked away from the water, he looked up at the sky, a sense of calm filling him. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him anymore. He had learned to forgive, to both himself and the people who had wronged him. Now, it was time to live for the future, a future he had control over. He pulled his phone from his pocket and typed a message to his father. Let's start fresh, Dad. We've got a lot to catch up on. And with that, Malik stepped into the future, no longer carrying the burden of his past, but ready to make something new out of the life he had ahead of him. Malik's journey was full of trials, pain, and difficult decisions, but in the end, he found peace. The past may shape us, but it doesn't have to control us. We can always choose to rebuild and create a better future. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you for watching, and remember, every new beginning starts with the courage to let go of the past.